Next up we have Max Doelling. Max is an assistant professor of digital media at TU Berlin, where he serves in the EU-funded digital media literacy research project, DigiPro, and researches the effects of transformative technologies on individual design processes. The project has resulted in several internationally published studies on the impact of integrating multi-domain building performance simulation into architectural design. Max graduated from TU Berlin in 2011 with a diploma in architecture. Prior to joining DigiPro, he gained academic experience as a digital design teaching assistant and volunteered as an urban and architectural designer for the Humane Society of the United States and India's Keystone Foundation, during which he worked on developing detailed sustainable design strategies. The title of this talk is, I'm not sure whether to pronounce the parenthetical or not.
I'll say it.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Is it better like that? Okay. Well, yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I had great fun last year, and I'm really glad to be back. I'm also really, the adrenaline starts pumping right now because it's such a good audience today. So I hope you're going to enjoy what I have to say today. So yeah, as already mentioned in the introduction, it's sort of my goal at the TU Berlin to teach in a sustainable media literacy project. You know, when I first took over at that project, I didn't really have a good focus. They were just teaching Rhino and Grasshopper and random digital media stuff. And together with my colleague, Dr. Farshad Nasrallah, and my tutor, Jeffrey, we decided pretty early on, because we had all of us had an interest in sustainable design, to move the project more into the direction of building simulation. Okay, so there are many different strategies of actually teaching building simulation and also doing research on it. And what most of these initiatives have in common is that they're usually not taught in a design-centric framework. You know, they're pretty isolated classes more often than not. And the framework that they're in is usually not really research-oriented. So to sort of remedy these doubts, we decided to put all this together and come up with an initiative that would indeed, in a design or a very highly design-centric framework, introduce combined thermal and daylight simulation into the early stages of the architectural design process. And by that I mean the very earliest ones, before the first sketch is even created, before we're going to talk about the design, and even at that stage to start thinking about thermal and energy concerns. Now, there are many doubts in building, or in design more than in building simulation, about applying simulation in design. And those doubts include, the usability of simulation, the feasibility of analysis results to positively and meaningfully impact design decisions, and that doubt still persists. And of course, a conflict of a political nature over what should be in a core studio. So our little initiative is sort of designed to address several of these doubts and come to conclusions to then make recommendations how we can proceed with integration of these technologies, which are ultimately ways of thinking and not technologies, into the design process itself. So yeah, there's the laser there. So yeah, what we're trying to do is, of course, investigate process, building, and form, performance impact on form, as well as design representations. And of course, teach energy literacy to a maximum number of architecture students in our case. So there's no technology students, it's just architecture students. To facilitate interdisciplinary processes and have them, of course, be emancipated actors in this ever-widening field that we find ourselves in. And sort of the framework that we're operating in is a design research framework. And to me, that includes that you should reflect on the means, methods, and procedures of design and process. And it's not a static thing where you create a result and then you analyze it and you're happy with it. But it's a process that continuously evolves as the design evolves, which of course makes analysis of design artifacts really difficult. Yes, and that has to be done from a rational, formal, and of course from a phenomenological perspective, meaning that in architecture you talk about artifacts having more value than just a pile of bricks. It's something more than that. Excuse me. So throughout the last 2.5 years, we've gone through several class iterations that I'm just showing real quick on this sheet. This is in chronological order. What they all have in common is that at the core they rely on architectural performance optimization, meaning we just shape the buildings according to having the best orientation, having good window-to-wall ratios, having certain overhangs or fixed shading, and the form of the building itself will change according to the performance goals that we have, and also according to the climate that we find ourselves in. So this is why I found the morphed climate WSP presentation really interesting, because we've been working in it's like 5 climate zones now throughout the last class iterations. So the ones that we have, it's a subtropical climate. It's 2 desert climates. Yazd is a bit more colder in winter than Hashgard. And there's a subarctic climate, and Berlin, which is cold continental. So we started actually with this kind of class, which is a community center. We call it Parametric Design, and a little part of offices, which is primarily the goal to optimize balance, the balancing of thermal and daylight concerns. Then we did another class, which is called Performative Design. That's been running for 2 semesters now. Concerned with housing design and a part, of course, urban design, which you see in this little irradiation model right here. And that has a pretty clear thermal performance focus and not that much daylight for various reasons that I'm going to talk about when I show an example from there. And then finally, which I'm going to show in the results section, we did a full-blown studio integration this semester. It's called the Robust Studio. We also had Robust today already, and I think it was your presentation again. It was Robust. So Robust was a difficult one, and that I will group under results and show you the results later and talk a bit about the difficulties of actually integrating these technologies, and again that kind of thinking into a design studio and the conflicts that potentialities that entails. So yeah, geometric optimization is happening in all of them. There's some fine tweaks. This is actually a bit more passively conditioned at times in the metrics that we look at. These are mechanically conditioned with a goal to minimize energy consumption. All right, I'm not going to dwell much on this slide. It just really describes real quick the metrics that we're using. That's basically all the pretty much standard consulting range of energy consumption and thermal comfort plus visual comfort metrics. So that's DEVA and Design Builder Energy Plus. So we just use validated tools. Because we talked about glare so much today, I have to admit that it's not the largest component, unfortunately, in our class for various reasons. We do, however, address it when it is apparent that in a given design it's going to start affecting thermal performance. You talk about passive solar gains coupled with visual discomfort. This is where we usually then in a given design go in there and say, okay, well, we're going to have a problem coming up right there. So that's glare to us was always more seen from well, at least in some of the topologies from an energy impact perspective. So you can talk about technicalities when it comes to metrics for a very long time. What became apparent to us in the process after a while is that the technical validity itself of these metrics doesn't, of course, by default provide good design outcomes. The metrics, you got to see them in conjunction with design intent. Any given project is different, and alongside other architectural representations that encode design intent. And the interpretation of them also shifts depending on typology and climate and design goals that we have, and we'll see them shift around a little bit in the case studies right here. Okay, so architectural designers they work through performance and design representations by really using a number of tools, and this is a pretty purposefully convoluted slide because it has just this very small representation of the design development of this design. And this is what you typically see. You start with sections, and you do tons of irradiation tests. You start testing glare with louvers or not. This is in the later stages Don't worry, I'll show a much more systematic development of one of those designs later on. This is just to give you a sense of the scale, very much reduced, of the sort of amount of representations people are dealing with in class. And this is typically then the performance representations that we look at as building scientists. So it's a balancing act that's actually occurring here. From the first iteration to the second iteration, what you'll see is that, so that's that design now, it goes from there to there. So the cooling energy use was radically reduced. The UDI 100 to 2000 lux was radically improved, as long as also the daylight availability, which is a metric that we hadn't used before. We use that now in the office spaces for these kind of buildings. So they are at a pretty tight target. And you can see that there's a clear correlation actually between the improvement of thermal performance and the improvement of daylight performance, which is of course calculated through the climate-based metrics. And that match is always basically the case in successful designs. Okay, let me switch to an example of what we got here. So when we look at a simplified process description of what's comparing two designs, actually here. So let's look at the interpretation of the metrics right here. I'll just describe real quick what we see. This is actually the radiation metrics, and this dotted line for summer and winter for both designs. And this is again the daylight performance plus, in this case, the heating energy consumption of these buildings right here. So the topmost design was in the final energy consumption less successful than the lower one. And what's curious is that in this housing design, the irradiation metrics are much more useful in actually gauging the performance potential that such a building has, because it's skin loaded. And you want, in this climate, this is Sweden, you want the maximum solar gains, which is why we also started working with these rapid prototyped irradiation models. So we just map the irradiation through Viper, and we prototype these models, and we have a desk full of them. And people can actually play with these models, and they show the solar shadows throughout the entire year, right on here. So this design was much more successful in that. This one was much more successful in that regard, with a much higher final energy utilization and a much lower heating energy consumption in the end. So, and you'll also see that the metrics that we're looking at here, as opposed to this design, which is much more balanced with daylight and thermal optimizations. Right here, because this is housing, the most important thing is the heating energy demand. And also in Sweden, not so much the cooling energy demand, which we didn't even chart, because we can actually mitigate that through other factors. So the UDI development, you'll see that these are direct gain buildings. So the UDI is actually not as good as you'd expect in an office building. Now, if you sort of standardize metrics and you'd say, okay, well, you got to reach this and this and that target, then this would be a pretty bad result. But actually limiting the solar gains will hurt the thermal performance. So right now in this design context, you got to make a decision. Okay, what do you want? Are you going to optimize for both domains, or are you going to optimize for the heating? And so the decision itself needed to be calibrated towards this sort of an approach in this case. And that's just a side comparison of how that might look like. This is clearly the culprit here. That part that has losses, and this is much better. Never mind the triangular space here. Yeah. So when we look at a more complex design development, this is something we're going to publish in Building Simulation in August. So this is a sheet that actually traces the precise design development steps taken by student designers throughout the entire design process. And what you'll see here are some curious things. For one, we have compound changes on multiple levels. There's something that came up. Usually you want to iterate through one factor, and then that factor is now set and we can move forward. Well, design doesn't happen like that. They're going to change 5 things at the same time, and then the challenge is going to be, okay, are you still going to understand building performance or not? In my opinion, you can. In the student's opinion, sometimes yes, sometimes not. Eventually they did succeed. So compounded changes, you can see so this is thermal performance, daylight performance, And this is the glazing solar gains right here, the dashed lines and the little icons for all of these design variants, plus the monthly heating, cooling, and lighting energy consumption for the final design, which is this one. So the compounded changes are happening right here. They actually, from here to here, they change the facade and they change where the program is, and they do the same thing again. The performance development itself isn't linear either. You know, it kind of looks linear here. But what they're doing is actually they're switching stuff around, changing all kinds of facades. This is all happening in independent tests. You know, they have independent models. Here they test the facade and they test the energy. Sometimes they bring it together, sometimes not. Depends on the designer. They add a glazed patio right here, this glazed interior yard, which then in that version actually massively increased the solar gains that they have. That's why they don't have quite a good improvement here in primary energy demand. And of course, external design thinking at the same time also figures into the equation, you know, because that stuff and that stuff doesn't really encode their design thinking. It's the sketches that they're actually producing and the conversations that they're having with us and amongst themselves. So this is, yeah, to me that was a really astonishing result, to really trace through all this and come up with that kind of a narrative. And based on that, you know, if we try to sum it up a little bit, I think the applicability and interpretation of these metrics to deliver design decisions as well as process are really not always straightforward. They're sometimes considered as straightforward. You know, when we look through certain papers that were published in building simulation, trying to actually integrate simulation into design, you'll find some really nice quotes like, the basic procedures involved in the design of a commodity are the same whether it be a toaster, a supersonic passenger aircraft, or a building. That's from 97. So even in 97, I'm not claiming that this is super representative, but you know it's published in a high-ranking venue. So let's just say that it passed some kind of peer review, and it could have been fair thinking. You know, just be fair. It was 97, and then we fast forward to 2009 when people started, based on previous work in the early 2000s, to actually chart in these enormous spreadsheets when to do what in a design process, right? So first of all, we're going to do the daylight. Then we know the daylight's good, right? So now we're going to do the thermal. And then everything's going to come crashing down, of course, at some point because the design decision will change. So how on earth are you going to harness this? So the quote is there, the performance parameters are extracted from guidebooks. Okay, so they go in the guidebooks and they look at the how do we do stuff, recommendations. It's still not, you know, in tune with a real design process. You know, for that, you got to do the experiment with tons of people and see how they design, which is what we did. So when we look at that process, there's some key observations to me. So of course the process is not linear. It's concurrently erratic, iterative, and case-specific, and linked to performance and design intent all at the same time. Simulation scope will increase, you know, through time, which is linked to two types of knowledge. You know, it's individual or task knowledge, which is constructed through designer making, which is actually recognized in other papers before us. And it coexists with quantified or multi-domain performance behaviors that actually continue to exist in a given design, encoded in usually digital models that then retain these performance behaviors. And they are, of course, objective within their evaluatory scope. So when we look at that, you know, beginning maybe in 2011, there was to me at least, very influential paper. It's called Think Designer by Rudy Staus and Raul Venancio. And that finally began to realize that the focus of simulations is or might be to solve design dilemmas. And that was a really key moment, you know, that we try to get away from the completely hermetically sealed parametric design processes that start with everything and start with every question and end with the answers to that question. And if you insert another question in the middle, it's just going to break, right? So Venancio and Staus, they really made a major contribution. Ironically, when you look at maybe by this chart here shown by, this is by Christopher Alexander and Chermayeff from 1963, what they already knew about architectural design thinking way back. This is a chart of design factor influence interlinkages. It's like two dots and they connect, and then this influences that. So 63, 2011, and we're sort of inching closer to one another. And based on what we learned, we started to come up with our own process model, if you want to call it that. And that's more like a dynamic field. And if anything, we've succeeded in making it look different from the models before that. It looks a bit more organic, so it's very important when you come up with these process models that they have to at least visually be differentiated. But all joking aside, I'm actually quite serious about that one, because what you usually have is many different performance domains, and design synthesis. This is not a static model. It's actually achieved when they overlap, and it's all embedded in design intent. Design intent is usually missing from other process models because they assume that performance or whatever is a means to an end. Well, it's always embedded in the greater idea of what a project is, okay? So what I visualize happening in this model is actually that design intent influences these individual domains. It will tell you what do you want from daylight, what do you want from thermal, what do you want from, I don't know what, the urban design. And these domains, when they actually get the aha moment, you go like, oh damn, when I turn the building like that, I'm going to get good light. That's one of those moments, right? And that's just going to then push back out, and it's going to inform design intent, which flows back in. And you can imagine them churning like a little volcano, and sometimes they're at odds, sometimes they're not. But this is intended to be a very dynamic model, and therefore a field that, takes away the static approach that we maybe had before that. Okay, so it's difficult to me. It's been a lot of hard thinking, the model. I think it always looks like nothing when you have it on the page, but after 2 years, yeah. I'm glad it's somehow articulated. So I think I'm going to skip through this, and if we have time, because I'm over time, right, Tara? Am I over time?
You're okay, yeah.
I'm okay?
7 more minutes.
Okay, that's cool. Well, then we'll just kind of continue with the second result, actually, which is building simulation in the studio. That might sound trivial. Okay, cool, you're doing simulations in the studio. It's hardly ever really done, seriously, with validated tools where you're really integrated into the design group, because maybe we should start with those pitfalls, because I started talking about it like that. What happens is that design staff and students must both be educated, because otherwise your colleagues in the design department aren't ever going to realize what it is you're doing with their students. They are tasked to deliver good design. So their professor shows up and they want good design. So they want a radiation map on the wall, and that's the design. Happened in the midterm critique, wall full of radiation maps. Professor walks in, she looks at me, I look at her, she goes like, Max, what on earth are you doing? Therefore, you've got to be really careful that you try to educate these people. There's, of course, conflicts of interest, and once you start, as we saw in the case studies, to influence whole building morphology, you can be in trouble, because of course there's a formal aspect and then there's a performance aspect, and whichever way you twist and turn the building isn't as simple as it might first seem, just when you look at it from a performance aspect. And it sort of happened to us. So if the studio itself is not primarily sustainability driven, then performance concerns can become mere add-ons. You start tweaking certain aspects, and the whole building is never going to be sustainable from the ground up, because you've made wrong decisions up front, and now you got to fix them. I mean, it haunted us to some extent. But on the positive side, what's actually happened is that students have much more work to do, yes, but much more time to work on design variants. We need the support by the mainstream of design departments actually to move simulations forward, because otherwise we're always going to be sidelined, and I think it's a fight we got to fight if we want to get into the mainstream of practice somehow. It's in any case a more realistic test environment of conflicting interests, and the results, I think they can be pretty representative of integrated design. It can be of rather high architectural quality. So just to show two of them. This is actually from the studio. And this is a very, very interesting project. Just some background. The studio itself is called Robust. They were supposed to create really massive masonry or concrete buildings. Think brutalism upgraded a little bit. And those buildings were supposed to, withstand the test of time, therefore robust. And therefore, it dealt with punching out individual windows from the mass right here, or in other projects that we'll see later, doing different sort of strategies. But let's start with this one. And I've explicitly picked this one because here in this little drawing, you can see different windows, and then how they imagined the light would be like. And then they started doing the simulations. So this is a clear, what I did show in the model before that, that they really start out externally thinking about what it is that they actually want from that specific part of the architecture. And then they set out to create a design that will actually achieve that based on validated climate-based metrics. So therefore, the metrics here look really curious because their concept is it's a study of alternating zones of light and dark. And of course, everybody can say that in a design that's going to happen. And if you show one rendering, usually the design professor is going to believe it. Well, is it really like that? Well, they did show to us that it actually is like that. So this is the UDI, summer and winter, and the DAV. And they have these shafts of light really coming into the building that give quite a deep and even illumination. And you can also sort of see that in the section. Now, is that a fully sustainable building, right? Is that completely as much a holistic process as we maybe saw before in the 4-point case study? No, unfortunately, it is not. And that's because you have that sort of friction, and you can only get so far, and you've got to try over and over again, until you calibrate these processes. Another really beautiful result, which is probably more in tune with such an event as this one, which is concerned with optimization, is what this group did. Same building, same program, same everything. That they actually used individual floor plates as enormous light shelves in their building. So they sort of moved it away from the facade and cut it out. And then they did show through different iterations. It's a regular facade, light shelf, shelf, and cutout, shelf, rotated. And for each of these iterations, what they did actually show was how the daylight for one major bay in this building was going to develop. And what they actually managed is to create a pretty uniform lighting situation while also avoiding overlit areas. And they were actually really happy with that result in that case. And I'm really happy with them too. So in conclusion, I think if you use simulation properly, whatever that might mean, it has, of course, a massively positive influence on integrated processes performed by designers. And what I try to emphasize is when you deal with designers, I'm one myself, so I should know, that design simulations are a part of craft. Because you can go on the moral level all the time. Oh, we got to fight climate change, and they got to be comfortable and whatever. If you appeal to the idea that you would want to know perhaps how your building performs and be proud of it, and that is craft, then I think you have an additional argument to make the whole thing more attractive. And of course, design-early simulations, in my opinion, they positively influence form, not negatively influence it. And I would hope that the performance research that maybe I could participate in or move forward would have them in a design-driven framework. So just to ask the question in the end of whether design changes everything or not, I think it's not as simple. Neither does simulation just change design or vice versa, but it's also encoded to me in that feedback loop of maybe that process model that we saw before. And I'm over time, and I will end. And thank you.
Questions? You solved pedagogy, so nothing to ask. Holly?
I'm just wondering how you did on time in this semester. Do you feel like this was a lot to cram into one semester, or do you feel like the students had...
Which semester? This the robots one here? This
well,
stuff?
maybe you could talk about each of them, I guess.
Okay.
It seems like I'm trying to teach the same tools as you in one semester, and it is kind of challenging at times.
Wait, which one? Okay, we had 3 of them.
Pick one.
Okay, time. I mean, challenge as far as you're concerned as an educator, how much time it's going to take? Okay.
Not your personal time, but just in the course of the semester, trying to cram everything that you want them to learn into one semester.
Okay, we had at least 1 3 to 4 hour lecture every week, so that was more than 12 to 14 hours of just someone talking, be it me or my colleagues, which is a lot. And then you probably have the same amount of time just in rough tutoring. I mean, this semester was extreme because we had this class and this class at the same time, so I was jumping back and forth between 2 studios, if you want. And you got to bug fix models, and it's labor intensive. It's more labor intensive than design studio education, where you can go there, and once a week you can tell them, look, I don't like that, maybe, can you fix it? And you come back a week later and they fix it, right? It doesn't work that in simulation. You go in there and then a week later they're back and the model is all, what's those set points? Okay, do it again, So it's labor intensive process. Yeah.
Approximately how many students are you working with at a time? How large are your class sizes?
About 20. This semester was more than 30, but in groups of 2. So at any given time we have 15 or more projects in 3 to 4 different climate zones that we got to do consulting on, basically, us as teachers, which is hard.
And you were the only one? How do you?
Huh?
You were the only one?
No, I did 1 semester alone of this. There were not that many students, so I'm glad. And then there's usually just 2 of us, but my colleague's not full time, so yeah, it's doable, but it's
Just curious, how much time do you spend educating your colleagues, other faculty members? You said that one of the hurdles is actually conveying the value in teaching this in studio to other faculty at the university. How do you convince them? Is it through the students' work? Is it?
Usually, I mean, we got invited to that studio integration because we've done good work before, and they sort of like the approach of having a robust building and geometric optimization. It appealed to them instead of just high-tech stuff. And then as far as educating them is concerned, we were fortunate that a lot of them actually attended our lectures. So even if they maybe at some point did not have tons of willingness to do it any longer, they were at that point locked in, and they were going to lose face if they back out. And then now it's all good because they got good results in the end, so nothing bad ever happened. But there's conflict in between, so you got to deal with that, and I think it's inevitable.
Were there any steps or concepts that were really hard for the students to do in the process?
I think the thinking in daylight, I think in many ways is easier to understand because it's something you can see, and visualizing thermal ideas, I think is much harder. I mean, this is actually something I'm not going to talk about much. I'm just going to show it. I skipped it because of time, but this is actually a tool that I'm going to release in September that does space-based multi-zone thermal metrics mapping, and that was intended to actually be used in class, but I didn't get it finished on time. To my shame, I must admit. But this maybe demonstrates, because of your question, that what designers need is a visual appreciation of where certain loads occur and what sort of multi-metric, this is solar gains, and this is the cooling load, and this is the air temperature, right? And you can see that east-west is more and stuff like that. Everybody in this room here knows that. Designers or students, they don't know that. So this is why they need something like this, or of course Diva, because this is of course directly inspired by Diva, just in the thermal aspect. So, but yeah, thermal abstraction, it's hard.
I was just curious if there's any hands-on analysis in terms of I guess it ties in understanding where these things come from, like the east-west, north-south sort of thing, especially if you're doing one of them kind of in Berlin, where you guys are located. Is there any sort of analog tools to complement the computer tools?
Yeah, I don't know whether I have them in this or any image in this presentation. Maybe. No, but we built sintered prototypes. We have a laser sinter, which can build really intricate shading geometries, for example. And we iteratively prototype stuff like shading screens also. It's nothing I wanted to dwell on that much today, but this is stuff we're doing. And then they actually have models that they can play with in the light or do facade sectional models. So there's a hands-on part. I personally find it sometimes really limited because you can't do thermal stuff in a scale model. And we want to do that in an integrated fashion all the time. And we know that the climate-based metrics are thermally correlated. As I said, improve them, you will improve thermal performance almost automatically unless you really mess it up. So yeah, it's not as much as I would want it to be, the hands-on stuff probably. Yeah.
I wonder if you comment. I think it was beautifully put when you said basically that in a good design, like loads will go down and daylight goes up. And that's not. I mean, that's not necessarily the case in a lot of design because it's often identified as a dilemma. So we'll attach something to that window to make it work better.
Yeah.
But to go back and work the massing and work skylighting and these things so that you don't resort to those solutions early on, I think it's great.
Thank you. It means a lot.
You shift around between using the UDI. It's not in that one. You had the bar graph with the 200, less than 100, 100 to 2,000, about 2,000.
This one?
And then sometimes you're using daylight availability.
Oh yeah, you see it best here.
You seem to, you're gravitating towards those metrics that are trying to identify overlit conditions or penalize overlit conditions.
In this case, yeah.
Where are you going with that? Where do you think, when do you use one versus another, or is there a certain metric that you prefer?
I think in this
case,
that
students seem to understand.
I think what they understand best is actually this one, which is what we usually never use, but we had to use it in this case. Oh God, do they have it on here? No, I'm sorry, but basically this group, when we worked on them and we worked out how they're going to present that to their studio professor, we used daylight autonomy because overlit is white. Okay, so dark is really dark and white is lit. Whereas in the UDIs, of course, understanding these three bins, it's challenging. Once they get it, they love it because they can really control what they're doing. Do I have too much? Do I have too little? But for general purposes, I think autonomy is really good, and we rely on that massively in studio. In our own class, for specific purposes, I love, and students also love the DAV because of the overlit provisions.
You get the pink. Yeah.
You get the pink, and you can see it.
I get rid of the pink.
Yeah. So, yeah, we use them all, basically. Radiation mapping is underrepresented in these slides, but it's massively used all the time. So.
Robert? Other than the simulation aspect of things, do you also teach the concepts behind some of the thermal and daylighting and all this stuff?
Yeah, we have like, I don't know, it's like 100 slide presentation just on daylight sky systems, what are the units themselves, how they're derived. We're doing the same, especially my colleague Farshad. He's more from the thermal side. I'm more from the daylight, and we both sort of were more similar in time after 2 years. So he sort of focuses more on basic thermal aspects and what's the U value, what's heat and mass transfer, and all that stuff. So yeah, but at the end of the day, do they really listen when you tell them that? In an unlimited fashion. They're interested in, they tweak the design, what happens? And then they think about, okay, what was that I just changed? And then they realize, oh God, that was the cooling energy consumption. They know eventually, but it functions backwards. Yeah.
So do you find that that students get into this, like you said, that tweaking, that sort of iterative process with the simulation and the response, and tweaking simulation and response? Do they get into that? Not
really. So that's why No, I think that's why this design intent part always features so prominently in what I'm talking about. I think formally, and also if they have some education in terms of performative architecture and they know what a light shelf is and they know how to orient a building, I think they upfront know pretty strongly what they want. And the tests that they perform will gravitate or will circle around. They're certainly like sharks around a boat, and they sort of know what they want. And they can massively improve performance. And in my books, that's really efficient because then they don't have to waste so much time on iterating through a billion parameter spaces. No critique involved of anyone who's doing that. If that's what you want to be doing, cool. But we usually don't have the time. So they got to want this thing, and they go for it. In fact, the ones who don't know, who don't have design intent, they're the ones who fail because they think they can derive everything from performance. The buildings they come up with are ugly and they don't perform. So just based on like 100 designs we did throughout the last 2.5 years, okay? My sample is limited.